Next is Professor Cheyney Ryan from the University of Oxford on how philosophers ignore militarism.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone again for putting this on and for attending. It's been really a great session so far. So I'm a political philosopher, and I'm interested, my larger interest is what would it look like to look at political philosophy from a pacifist perspective. So I've been interested in looking at the great figures of political philosophy and how would we critique them from a pacifist perspective, and specifically recently looking at contemporary Anglophone political philosophy, in which John Rawls is the hegemonic figure to a degree that actually itself requires explanation of why one figure could so dominate a field as John Rawls has. So I'm going to talk about Rawls, and so that's for political philosophers probably most of all. And second of all, some of what I'm going to say is American-centric because it's putting him in an American context. I guess my one argument for that is that America is, after all, the dominant imperialist military power, so there's a reason to take interest in what America is doing. The main thing I want to talk about is that what you see in political philosophy and what you see in Rawls is that war is simply not discussed. So it's not the case that what you get is extensive justifications of wars and military. What you get is essentially silence around the whole question of war. It reminds me of when I was very young, you know, when the civil rights movement was just going and America was still an apartheid state. What you saw in mainstream thinking was not justifications of it. What you saw was simply silence around it. It was silence around racism. That was the form of acceptance, and it's silence around war that I think is the form of acceptance. So what I want to say some things today about is about how to understand the silence in Rawls and mainstream political philosophy. And what I want to suggest is that it's partly related to their picture of what war is. In my work, I distinguish, as other people have, two aspects of war, war making and war building. War making is battles, war making is what you see in war movies. War building is the institutions of war, or militarization, I think, as we're talking about. I think that mainstream political philosophy ignores war because they think of war as war making, an episodic thing that occurs once in a while, and they don't think at all about war building, which is an ongoing activity of organizations, and so they miss the essence. As Clausewitz said the essence of war is actually war building, and you make a mistake if you ignore that. So how did this, how to understand this situation? I distinguish two traditions of political philosophy. One is the liberal tradition and one is the Republican tradition. Now, in political philosophy, we don't use those terms, and particularly we don't use the term republicanism to designate the Republican Party. We mean a tradition of political thinking that actually goes back to Greece, and where the notion of a republic is the primary notion. What does it mean to be a republic? So the liberal tradition is a tradition that would be identified with figures like John Stuart Mill or with the philosopher Henry Sidgwick, who's very influential now in Anglophone political philosophy. Both John Stuart Mill and Sidgwick were theorists of the British Empire who actually maintained that war was not very important. I mean, think about that. In the 19th century, you had the two theorists, the two leading British theorists, saying that war is not a significant political phenomenon. What they of course mean is that that's because it's going on somewhere else and not in the home country. They regarded war as incidental. Mill says hardly anything about it. Sidgwick says a little bit about it, but if you look at their works, there's as little about war as you find in John Rawls. John Rawls's book, A Theory of Justice, is about 350 pages long. There is a total of about 4.5 pages devoted to war. And those pages are not devoted to war, they're devoted to conscientious objection, So there's almost nothing about war, okay? And that's significant. That is typical of the liberal tradition, I want to say, and the great liberal thinkers. For them, the main problem is liberalism versus totalitarianism. That would be today what someone would say the main issue is, liberalism versus totalitarianism. Now, the Republican tradition, and this goes back to Aristotle, the Republican tradition is a tradition which says that war building is what the state is all about. States exist to defend us, and to defend us, what a state primarily does is organized for war. But in the modern versions of republicanism, that is viewed as much a danger as it is a possibility. So the dangers of war building are paramount in this tradition. And the irony is that much of the strongest things about the dangers of war building as a central problem of the state are found in American political documents. And I say the irony is because John Rawls is an American political thinker who says that he is articulating, among other things, the American traditions of liberalism. And yet he has nothing to say about the major American political documents. So the examples I would give of this are the Federalist Papers, which were the writings that were used to justify the American Constitution, the Constitution itself, and then essays that followed it. And the best example would be Henry David Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience, which is about war resistance. It's an essay about the imperatives of war resistance. What the Federalist Papers and the US Constitution say is that the fundamental danger to a republic is becoming an empire. That's the danger. So the problem is not liberalism versus totalitarianism, it's a republic versus empire. You become a republic when war building takes over everything else and becomes and corrupts the entire society. So that half of the Federalist Papers are devoted to the dangers of war building. The American Constitution, half of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are directed toward the dangers of war building, et cetera, because the anxiety was that the Americans did not want to become another British empire. Now, let's be honest about this. They wanted their own empire, and they had a different idea about how to do it. But the anxiety was that America not become like Great Britain. They saw this, the analogy of the corruption of the Roman Empire. Republic versus empire is the major danger. Now, this remained a salient issue up until the mid-20th century in the United States. Now, I know other countries too, but I'm just talking about the United States. The fundamental moment in American politics was World War I, because World War I was incredibly repressive in the United States. It was a repression of a sort that had not been seen before. And it re-raised the question of, is war compatible with a republic? Can republics wage war at all? And this is when you had the emergence of pacifism of a type that drew on what's called the peace nation tradition in the United States. Okay, so many of the pacifists of that era were people that grew out of this Republican anxiety about war. And this was a major, major crisis that ensued, partly because many of the mainstream liberal thinkers were rah-rah First World War, and the main example was John Dewey, who was a great supporter of World War I, and said that liberalism could be furthered by war, okay? Henceforth, I think there was division in liberalism. There's a fundamental division in liberalism that materialized most directly during the Cold War, okay? Because on the one hand, you had liberals in the Cold War, American liberals, saying that liberalism and war were fully compatible with each other. And the example of this would be Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who was a prominent American intellectual. And the paradigm of this would be John F. Kennedy, that liberalism and war are not only compatible with each other, but they're mutually supporting of each other, okay? And the term I've coined for this is martial liberalism. It's liberalism tied to the war project, okay? Very bellicose, very supportive of the military, and indifferent to the concerns about the dangers to civil liberties of the military, just indifferent to the threat to liberalism from the military. The Republican anxieties about all of that was carried on by the New Left in the United States. So what happened was that the traditional concerns about the military became articulated by New Left thinkers. The one who lives on now is Noam Chomsky. Okay, so Noam Chomsky represents a kind of an anarchist version of anxiety about the military state, anxiety about what it does to civil liberties, et cetera, et cetera. Another figure that is very important in the United States, and I don't know if people know of him elsewhere, is the historian Howard Zinn, whose textbook is read, and Howard Zinn was one of my professors, so I'm very beholden to him. But Zinn was someone who carried on this notion that there was a Republican strain, concern about military establishments, concern specifically that the greatest threat to liberty was from the military. The greatest threat to liberties was from the military. Now, how did it happen that you have this issue from the founding of America up through the Cold War, and soon afterwards, the leading American political thinker does not talk about war at all, does not talk about military establishments, ignores this as a problem for liberalism. See, to me, that's in some sense a challenge I would raise to anyone in that Rawlsian perspective about how could this be so ignored? Well, there's an interesting, again, ironic story about this, which we now know because there's a lot of biographical information about Rawls. Rawls was a graduate student in the 1950s. He could not be a political philosopher because of political repression in the United States. It was too unpopular to even study political philosophy. So he came and studied at Oxford instead. So Rawls's political philosophy was in some sense very much a product of 1950s Oxford, which would kind of give you an idea of why he might develop a political philosophy which was detached from America's own anxieties about this. Though I would say, isn't it ironic that someone who has to leave the United States from political repression develops a theory that pays no attention to the political repression that's coming from the war? Okay, and that's, I don't know whether irony, paradox is the right word for that. Rawls develops a very amiable social democratic vision of society. I tell my students in the United States that Rawls is the Clement Attlee of philosophy. The problem is that no one in the United States knows who Clement Attlee was. So but he's kind of the Clement Attlee of mild-mannered, amiable kind of egalitarianism. No concern really with issues of national security, no concern with war and peace, no concern with their threat to civil liberties, et cetera, et cetera. So at the end of the Vietnam War, John Rawls publishes his magnum opus, a book which coincided with the Vietnam War, its composition. And at that point, war is no longer discussed by political philosophers. Which put, I think, people of my generation in a rather odd position because we had been radicalized by the Vietnam War. But then political philosophy becomes something that war is no longer a topic. Why is it not a topic? Because the liberal perspective says war is incidental to what society is about. War is something that it's like disaster relief. Every once in a while it comes along and you need to be ready for it, but it doesn't fundamentally affect the political society. If I had more time, I would talk about how just war theory fits into this, because 20 years later was the emergence of what's called just war theory in political philosophy. But the problem with just war theory is that it too focuses on war making. And so it doesn't ask fundamental questions about how war is in some sense toxic for society as a whole. I would say that I think this is changing. Books by Ned and other people have addressed this, which is why I think I see some of these developments in just war theory that people like Ned are doing as not just reorienting just war theory. They're going to redefine the relationship to political philosophy generally. What are the, where do we go next? Well, again, I would suggest a lot of what we're doing at this conference is exactly where we go. The big issue for the Republican tradition was corruption. That was the danger. The danger was corruption. And the danger was two things: militarily overpowered institutions and a passive citizenry. The two things always went together. And because the assumption was that centralized power, one of the things it does is make people passive. This kind of a Foucaultian theme, but I think it very much engages this. So I think we need to look more at how the society has been corrupted. I think that for the American perspective, we need to think more about how we are an empire and not a republic anymore. That has been completely, that tradition I think has been completely forgotten about in our country. And it's been forgotten about partly because, again, of some of the things Ned was just mentioning, of this kind of overpraising of the military, which would have been anathema to the founders of the United States. Anyone who studies the early period of the United States realizes that they did not want a permanent military. Even General George Washington, who was the commanding general in the Revolutionary Army, resigned from the military because he said we should not have military leaders in the government. I would only add, by the way, this last remark of issue of mine, we have a great prestige of the military in America, but no one wants to be in it. Absolutely no one wants to be in the military. What would happen if you gave a war and no one came? That's what happened with the Iraq War. A week after 9/11, enlistment started dropping dramatically. And the story of the Iraq War was they didn't have enough soldiers, okay? So in some sense, I think we underemphasize the absurdity of the situation when we don't realize that there's all this yay, honor the troops, but don't become one yourself. And it's that constraint on the military, which is fundamental to what is happening in the United States today. Okay, so I'll stop there. Thank you.